dawn on the wall of a city that is about to stop existing. You have been awake all night because everyone in the city has been awake all night, and now the gray light is coming up over the plain, and you can finally see what has been making the sound. It is an army. But that word is not quite right for what is standing on the plain below you, because you have seen armies before. Armies are a crowd of angry men. This is not a crowd, this is something built. The ranks are straight in a way that ranks are not supposed to be straight. The iron on it catches the first light all at once in a single cold line. There are horses in their own ordered blocks. There are wheeled towers, taller than your wall, being rolled slowly forward on rollers by men who are not afraid. And at the base of your wall, already engineers, calm as bricklayers, are building a ramp of earth and stone up toward you, so that the thing behind them can climb. Nobody down there is shouting. That is the part that empties your stomach. They have done this before, many times, and it has always worked. And they know it will work here. They are not fighting your city so much as processing it. And here is what you understand standing on that wall in the last hour that your world exists. This is not bad luck. This is not a raid. This is policy. Somewhere far to the east, in a palace on a river, there is a king who has decided that your city should be an example. And there are craftsmen who will later carve what happens here onto the walls of his throne room in careful detail, so that every ambassador who comes to beg for peace will have to walk past the picture of you on his way in. That was the Assyrian Empire. For 3 centuries, it was the most frightening power on earth, and it worked very hard to make sure you knew it. Tonight, we are going to do 2 things. We are going to walk out onto that plain and take apart the machine, the first true army the world had ever seen, and how it was built. And then we are going to walk into the empire behind it, which was crueler than almost anything before it, and also, strangely, the place that gave us the world's first great library. We will find out how much of the horror was real and how much was advertising. And we will follow it all the way to the night the machine itself was broken, and the most feared empire in the world vanished so completely that, a little while later, people would walk over its buried cities and not know they were there. So come up onto the wall with me while it is still standing. Hello and welcome to Quiet History. This is a channel for the hour before sleep. One long, true story told slowly, calm enough to drift off inside of. There is nothing here you need to stay awake for, so let it come to you gently. If these quiet nights help you, a like and a subscribe are what keep them coming. You can tap one now while your hands are still awake, and then set the phone aside for the night. Tonight, we are going back nearly 3,000 years to the Empire of Assyria. Assyria has a reputation, and the reputation is mostly true. If you know one thing about the Assyrians, it is probably that they were cruel, that they flayed their enemies and impaled them, and marched whole nations away from their homes in chains, and they did do those things. I am not going to pretend otherwise tonight, though I am also not going to dwell on the worst of it, because there is no need. This is a channel for sleep, and the horror is not the point. But here is the part that is more interesting than the cruelty, and that we are really here for. The Assyrians were not simply savages who happened to win. They were, in a real sense, the inventors of the thing we now call an empire. They built the first professional standing army in history, soldiers who were paid and trained all year and organized like a machine. They built roads and a postal relay and a system of governors and provinces that later empires, all the way down to Rome and Persia, would quietly copy. And the same kings who boasted about their brutality also gathered, in a palace in a city called Nineveh, the first great library the world had ever known, and it is because of them, and only because of them, that we still have the oldest story humanity ever wrote down. So the puzzle of the Assyrians is the puzzle of how those two things live in the same hand: the terror and the library, the war machine and the scholar king. And there is one more thing worth saying before we begin, the honest thing this channel always says. A great deal of what we know about Assyrian cruelty, we know because the Assyrians told us themselves. They carved it on their walls, wrote it in their annals, on purpose to frighten. So part of tonight is learning to tell the difference between what they actually did and what they wanted the world to believe they did. Sometimes those are the same, sometimes they are not. So settle in, turn the lights down low. We are going up the Tigris, 3,000 years ago, to the land of the god Ashur, and the most feared empire the ancient world ever produced. Chapter 1. The land at the top of the rivers. To understand why Assyria became what it became, you have to start where it sat, because geography did a great deal of the shaping. Everyone remembers Mesopotamia as the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the flat green cradle where cities and writing were born. But Mesopotamia is really two countries, not one. Down in the south, near where the rivers pour into the sea, the land is hot and flat and wet, laced with canals, and that is the old country, the land of Sumer and, later, of Babylon, which we visited not long ago. That is where it all began, and the Assyrians never forgot it. They looked south the way a rough northern cousin looks at an old and elegant city, with resentment and with longing, and with the certainty that they could take it if they wanted to. Assyria itself was the north. Up here, along the upper Tigris, the land is higher and harder. There is enough rain in most years to grow grain without the endless canal digging of the south, which was a blessing. But there was a curse folded inside the blessing, and it is the key to everything. The north had no natural borders, no sea to the back, no wall of mountains close enough to hide behind, no desert wide enough to stop an army. It was open country on every side, surrounded by peoples who could come down out of the hills or across the plain whenever they were strong and Assyria was weak. A land like that teaches its people one lesson over and over across centuries until it is written into the bone. The lesson is this: there is no safety except strength, and there is no strength except the ability to hit the other man first and harder and further away. A people that cannot retreat learns to attack. A country with no walls builds an army instead. That is the deep root of the Assyrian war machine. It did not come from some special cruelty in the blood. There is no such thing. It came from 3,000 years of living in a place where the only alternative to conquering was being conquered, and where the memory of every raid and every burned harvest sat in the back of the mind, insisting that it must never happen again. They did not build any of this from nothing. This is worth saying clearly, because it is easy to imagine the Assyrians as barbarians who stumbled out of the hills. They were nothing of the kind. They were Mesopotamians, heirs to everything the South had invented across the previous 2,000 years. The writing, the mathematics, the law, the gods, the whole deep inheritance of Sumer and Babylon. They wrote in the same wedge-shaped script, pressed into the same wet clay. They worshipped versions of the same gods. They read the same ancient stories. What they added to that inheritance was not culture. It was organized force, at a scale nobody had ever managed before. So keep the picture in your mind as we go. An old, literate, sophisticated people sitting on open ground they could never quite defend, slowly deciding over centuries that the answer to their fear was to build the most efficient instrument of war. Chapter 2. Ashur, the god and the city. Assyria takes its name from a single place, and that place takes its name from a god, and the god and the city and the country were, for the Assyrians, very nearly the same thing. The place was Ashur, a city on a rocky spur above the Tigris, in the northern land, one of the oldest continuously inhabited spots in that whole ancient world, and Ashur was also the name of the god who lived there. He was the national god, the god of the Assyrians specifically, in a way that was unusual even in the ancient world. Other gods belonged to a city or to a piece of nature or to a task. Ashur belonged to a people. To be Assyrian was, in a sense, to be one of Ashur's men. When the empire later went to war, it did not go to war for the king, or not only for the king. It went to war for Ashur, to extend his reach, and every conquest was, in the official telling, an act of devotion. The god wanted the world, and the army was how he took it. This matters because it means the violence we are going to talk about was, to the people doing it, holy. It was not cruelty for its own sake in their minds, whatever it looks like to us. It was the sacred work of extending the god's order over the chaos outside. That is a much more dangerous idea than simple cruelty, and it is a large part of what gave the Assyrian state its terrible, patient energy. Now, when we say the Assyrian Empire, we usually mean one particular stretch of time, the last and greatest version, the one historians call the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which ran for roughly the last 3 centuries before its fall. That is the empire of the famous kings and the carved walls and the war machine at its height, and it is where we will spend most of tonight. But it was not the beginning. Assyria was already old by then. Long before the empire, back near the very dawn of history, Ashur was a modest kingdom of traders. Its merchants ran donkey caravans hundreds of miles north into the land of Anatolia, carrying tin and fine cloth, keeping careful accounts on clay tablets that we can still read. The ordinary letters of ordinary businessmen complaining about debts and bad roads 4,000 years ago. Then Assyria rose into a real power and fell back, and rose again, across 1,000 years of Mesopotamian history, sometimes strong, sometimes swallowed by Babylon or by others, always there, always recovering. So by the time our story really begins, the Assyrians had already been a people for a very long time. They had risen and been beaten down and risen again more times than they could count. And that long, hard memory of being a nation that kept nearly dying and kept refusing to die is part of what stood behind the empire when it finally came. These were not beginners. They were survivors who had at last decided to stop merely surviving. What turned that old, tough, recurring kingdom into the superpower of the ancient world was not a slow drift. It was, to a remarkable degree, the work of one man and a set of decisions he made in the middle of the 8th century. Chapter 3. The Man Who Built the Machine. Around the year 745 before Christ, a man took the throne of Assyria who would, in a single reign, turn a strong but ordinary kingdom into an engine of conquest unlike anything the world had seen. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III. He is not as famous as some of the kings who came after him, the ones with the great palaces and the carved lions. But everything they did on the foundation he laid. If you want to point at the moment the Assyrian war machine was truly built, you point at him. Assyria before him was powerful, but it had a problem that every ancient kingdom shared and that limited them all. Its army was ultimately a seasonal thing. When the king wanted to campaign, he called up his nobles, and the nobles called up the farmers who owed them service, And this crowd of part-time soldiers gathered, fought for a season, and then had to go home, because they were farmers and the harvest would not wait, and if they stayed in the field too long, there would be no food. An army like that can win battles, but it can only reach as far as it can march and still get home for the harvest, and it dissolves every autumn, and it has to be rebuilt every spring. It is a tool you can only pick up for a few months a year. Tiglath-Pileser looked at this and did something that sounds simple and was revolutionary. He built an army that did not go home. He created what was, as far as we can tell, the first true professional standing army in history. Soldiers who were not farmers during the season of service, but full-time men, paid by the state, trained all year round, kept in being permanently whether there was a war on or not. This is one of those inventions that is so basic to how we think about power now that it is hard to feel how strange and new it was. A permanent army, a body of men whose entire life was war, maintained by the treasury, ready at any moment in any season to march in any direction and stay in the field for as long as the king required. The effects of that one change rippled through everything. An army that never disbanded could campaign year after year without pause, wearing down enemies who still had to stop and plant their crops. It could march far beyond the old harvest limited range, because it was never coming home for the harvest. It could hold conquered territory with garrisons instead of abandoning it every autumn. And because the soldiers were the king's men, paid by the king, loyal to the king and not to the local nobles who used to raise them, the whole army became an instrument of the crown in a way it had never been before. Tiglath-Pileser had not just built a better army, he had taken the army out of the hands of the aristocracy and made it belong to the state. He reorganized the empire's insides to match. He broke up the great provinces that ambitious governors had used as private power bases and cut them into smaller pieces, easier to control, harder to rebel with. He built up the machinery of administration that could feed and pay and move a permanent army. In other words, he did not only build the sword, he built the arm and the body behind the sword, the state that could keep such a machine running for generations. Everything the famous Assyrian kings would later do, the vast conquests, the great palaces, the terror carved on the walls, was made possible by this quiet, organizational revolution. So before we look at the machine in action, we should look at how it was. Chapter 4: Iron and Order. Let us walk down off the wall and look closely at the machine standing on the plain, because the details are where its real advantage lay. Start with the metal. The Assyrians came to power at exactly the moment the ancient world was changing over from bronze to iron, and they rode that change harder and better than anyone. For thousands of years, the best weapons had been made of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Bronze is fine, but tin is rare and had to be carried in from far away, which made bronze weapons expensive, which meant only a limited number of men could be properly armed. Iron was different. Iron ore is common, found almost everywhere, and once smiths learned to work it well, iron held a harder, sharper, more durable edge than bronze ever had. The Assyrians equipped their army with iron on a scale nobody had matched. Iron swords, iron spearheads, iron scale armor, arrowheads by the tens of thousands. They could arm not a select few, but a whole standing army in metal that was better and more plentiful than their enemies could field. That alone tilted every battle before it began. Then look at how the men were organized, because this is where the word machine really earns itself. The Assyrian army was not a single mass. It was a combination of specialized parts, each doing one job, all working together. There was the infantry, the backbone, spearmen with tall shields who held the line, and behind and among them, archers, rank on rank, who could fill the sky with iron-tipped arrows. There were slingers whose stones could crack a skull at a distance. There was cavalry, men fighting from horseback, which was still a fairly new art, and which the Assyrians developed into a real striking arm, fast and flexible, able to sweep the flanks and run down a broken enemy. There were the chariots, older and heavier, carrying archers into battle as mobile platforms. And crucially, there were the engineers, a whole corps of them, the men we saw building the ram, who could bridge rivers, cut roads through hills, and take apart a walled city stone by stone. An army built of specialized parts that train together and fight together is worth far more than the sum of its men, and the Assyrians understood this generations before anyone else. Where an enemy brought a brave crowd, the Assyrians brought a coordinated system, archers softening the line, infantry holding it, cavalry turning the flank, engineers already at work on the walls behind. It was, in a real sense, the first army in history that fought like a single organism rather than a gathering of warriors. Behind all of it stood the thing that made it possible to keep such a force in the field: logistics. Boring word, decisive thing. The Assyrians built up supply depots, stockpiled weapons and grain, organized the movement of food and fodder along their roads so that the army could march for months and arrive still fed, still armed, still whole. Amateurs talk about battles, professionals talk about supply, and the Assyrians were the first great professionals. Their enemies' armies melted away when the food ran out. The Assyrian army did not, because someone whose whole job was supply had already thought about it. Put all of it together: the iron, the specialized arms fighting as one, the engineers, the supply trains, the permanent professional corps, and you have something the ancient world had simply never faced. Not a bigger crowd, a machine. And a machine, once it exists, wants to be used. What it was used? Chapter 5. No wall could hold. In the ancient world, a city was its wall. That was the whole idea of a city, a place strong enough that you and your family and your grain could get behind the wall when the raiders came, and be safe. For thousands of years, walls mostly worked. An attacker could burn the fields and kill the stragglers, but a well-built wall with determined people behind it could hold, and eventually the attacker, unable to stay forever, would go home. The wall was the guarantee at the center of settled life. The Assyrians broke that guarantee. More than any people before them, they made themselves masters of the siege, of the science of taking a walled city that did not want to be taken, and once they had truly learned it, no wall in their world was safe. That is a bigger deal than it sounds, because it changed the fundamental bargain of the age. Suddenly, the wall was not a guarantee. Suddenly, getting behind it might just mean you were all in one place when the end came. How did they do it? Not by magic, and not by simply throwing men at the stones until enough of them died. They did it with method, several methods together, applied by men who did this for a living. They built siege engines, great wheeled towers rolled up against the walls so that archers on top could shoot down at the defenders and clear the battlements, and so that a heavy ram housed in the tower's base could swing against the wall or the gate and batter it apart. They built ramps, exactly like the one we watched at the start, vast sloping mounds of earth and rubble piled against the city wall, so that the towers could be pushed up level with the top, or so that the soldiers could simply walk up and over. They undermined the walls, digging tunnels beneath the foundations to weaken them until they cracked and fell. They cut the city off completely, ringing it so that nothing came in, no food, no water, no help. And then they waited, because hunger and thirst are patient soldiers who never tire. And all of this was done with a calm, engineering competence that must have been more frightening than any amount of screaming. The Assyrians approached the city the way a demolition crew approaches a building. They had done it 100 times. They knew how long it would take. They had the tools and the men and the food to outlast you, and the engineers were already measuring your wall while their king ate his dinner. We have an extraordinary window into one of these sieges, because the Assyrians left us a picture of it. When King Sennacherib took the city of Lachish in the land of Judah around 700 years before Christ, he had the entire campaign carved in stone across the walls of a room in his palace, panel after panel of it in astonishing detail. You can see the ramp going up. You can see the siege engines rolling forward, and the archers and the defenders throwing down torches, and the attackers coming up under their cover. You can see the city falling and what came after. It is one of the most detailed depictions of ancient war that survives anywhere, and we will come back to it because it was not carved as a record, it was carved as a message. For now, hold on to the simple world-changing fact of it. The Assyrians had made the walled city, humanity's oldest refuge, obsolete. If they decided your city should fall, it would fall. The only question left to you was whether to fight and be made an example of, or to open your gates and hope for mercy. And the Assyrians worked very hard and very deliberately to make sure you chose the gates. How they did that, the calculated use of terror, is the darkest. Chapter 6: Terror by Design. Now we come to the cruelty, and we have to talk about it carefully, because it is both the most famous thing about the Assyrians and the most misunderstood. Let us be honest first about what is true. The Assyrians did terrible things to the people who resisted them, and they did not hide it. Their own royal inscriptions, the official annals of the kings, written to be read and remembered, describe punishments of the defeated in language that is hard to read even now: flaying, impaling, burning, the heaping up of the dead. Kings boasting in the first person of the pillars of bodies they raised outside rebel cities and the skins they hung on the walls. This is not later slander invented by their enemies. This is the Assyrian state describing itself, in its own words, proudly. But here is the thing you have to see, the thing that turns simple horror into something colder and more interesting. Most of this was not rage, it was policy. It was, quite deliberately, a form of advertising. Think about the problem the Assyrians were trying to solve. They were a relatively small people trying to hold down an enormous empire full of subject nations who did not want to be ruled. They could not put a large garrison in every city. There were not enough Assyrians. So they needed something cheaper than constant force. They needed fear. They needed every city that was thinking about resisting to already know, before the army even arrived, exactly what resistance would cost, so vividly, so certainly, that most cities would simply give up rather than find out. Terror, applied loudly to the few who resisted, was a way of not having to fight the many. So the cruelty was made visible on purpose. The point of impaling the leaders of a rebel city was not only to punish that city, it was to make sure the next 10 cities heard about it. And this is where the carved walls come in. Remember the reliefs of the siege of Lachish, carved across a room in Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. That room was not private. It was a place where foreign envoys waited for their audience with the king, which means that an ambassador who had come to negotiate, a man representing some far-off city wondering whether to submit or resist, was made to sit and wait, surrounded on every wall by a giant, detailed, beautiful, methodical picture of exactly what happened to the last people who resisted. The message was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. Submit and live. Resist and become the next mural. And notice how the violence is shown in those carvings, because scholars who study them point to something chilling. It is not shown as wild or passionate, it is shown as orderly, bureaucratic almost, rows of prisoners processed, deportees counted and marched. Punishment carried out like a job of work. That coldness was the point. A furious enemy you might reason with or outlast. A calm one who does this the way a clerk files a document and has done it 100 times and will do it 100 more. There is no reasoning with that. The calm was itself a weapon. So when we ask the honest question, were the Assyrians really as monstrous as their reputation? The honest answer has two parts. Yes, real people really suffered these things, and we should not soften that. But also, the Assyrians worked hard to make their cruelty seem even larger than it was, because a fearsome reputation did their conquering for them. Some of the horror in those inscriptions is a king exaggerating, piling up the grim numbers, painting himself as the terror of the world, precisely so that the world would not make him prove it. The atrocity was real. The advertisement of the atrocity was, if anything, even bigger. And telling those two apart is part of what it means to look at the Assyrians honestly, instead of just shuddering and looking away. There was, though, one Assyrian practice that was less about spectacle and more about cold administration, and in the long run, it may have reshaped the age. Chapter 7: Moving Peoples. Of all the things the Assyrians did, the one with the longest shadow was not a battle or a massacre. It was an administrative decision carried out again and again on a scale never seen before. They moved entire peoples from one end of the empire to the other. The policy was simple and cold and effective. When the Assyrians conquered a troublesome kingdom, instead of leaving the defeated people in place to nurse their grievances and rebel again, they would uproot a large part of the population, often the leaders, the skilled, the ones most likely to organize resistance, and march them hundreds of miles away to some other corner of the empire. And into the emptied land they would bring other deported people from somewhere else entirely, strangers with no roots in that soil and no local network to rebel with. Two populations, each torn from home, each set down among strangers, each now dependent on the imperial order that had moved them and could feed them or starve them. You can see the terrible logic of it. A people in its own land, among its own kin, with its own memory of freedom, is a standing danger. Scatter that people among strangers 1,000 miles from anything they know, surrounded by other uprooted groups who do not even speak their language, and the danger largely dissolves. There is no homeland left to fight for. The homeland now has strangers living in it. Rebellion needs roots, and the Assyrians simply pulled the roots up. Over the roughly 3 centuries of the empire, historians estimate that something on the order of 4 million people were moved this way. It was, in a sense, empire building through the mass rearrangement of human beings, run with the same industrial efficiency as everything else the Assyrians did. The most famous case, for reasons that would echo for thousands of years, was the Kingdom of Israel. In the year 722 before Christ, after a long siege, the Assyrians took Samaria, the capital of the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel. And they did to it exactly what they did everywhere. They deported a large part of the population. The Assyrian king Sargon II recorded the number himself. Over 27,000 people carried away from Samaria and its surroundings, resettled in distant provinces of the empire, and replaced with deportees brought in from elsewhere. Those deported Israelites are the origin of one of the most enduring legends in history, the so-called 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. Marched away into the Assyrian Empire, resettled among strangers, They did what deported peoples usually did over the generations. They blended into the populations around them, and as a distinct people, they disappeared from the record. Not, most likely, killed, absorbed, which is its own kind of ending. For thousands of years afterward, people would tell stories about where the lost tribes had gone and search for them at the edges of the world. The truthful answer is quieter and sadder than the legends. They went where the empire sent them, and there they slowly stopped being themselves. That was the whole point of the policy. It is worth holding both halves of this in your mind together, because it is a good example of how to look at the Assyrians honestly. On one hand, deportation was a human catastrophe, repeated hundreds of times, families broken, homelands emptied, whole peoples erased not by slaughter but by scattering. We should not dress that up. On the other hand, it was not mindless savagery. It was a calculated tool of statecraft, and a fairly sophisticated one, aimed at making a giant empire governable. The Assyrians were not tearing peoples apart for the pleasure of it. They were doing it because it worked, because it turned rebellious nations into a manageable, mixed, rootless population that could be ruled. That is, in some ways, more unsettling than simple cruelty, not less. It is cruelty with a spreadsheet behind it. And ruling that giant, rearranged empire took more than fear and deportation. It took roads and records and governors and a common language, the unglamorous machinery of administration. Chapter 8: Running the Machine. It is easy with the Assyrians to get lost in the war and the terror and to miss the quieter thing underneath, which may actually be their most important legacy. They did not just conquer an empire, they worked out how to run one. And most of the tools they invented or perfected for that job are still, in one form or another, how large states are run today. Start with the problem. An empire stretching for 1,000 miles and more, full of dozens of conquered people speaking different languages, is almost impossible to hold together by force alone. The army cannot be everywhere. Word of a rebellion in some distant province might take weeks to reach the king, by which time the province might be lost. To rule at that scale, you need something more than soldiers. You need information to move faster than trouble. So the Assyrians built roads, not paved highways in the Roman sense, but maintained royal roads, cleared and guarded, running out from the heartland to the edges of the empire. And along those roads they ran a relay system for messages, a chain of stations at regular intervals, each kept supplied with fresh mounts and riders, so that a message could be handed from one to the next and carried across the whole empire at a speed no single traveler could match. A royal order or a warning of revolt could fly from the frontier to the palace in a matter of days rather than weeks. This is the ancestor of every postal system and every imperial road network that came after, including the famous one the Persians would build on top of the Assyrian foundations a couple of centuries later. The Assyrians, in effect, invented the idea that an empire is held together not only by its army, but by its ability to communicate faster than its enemies can conspire. They divided the empire into provinces, each under a governor who answered directly to the king, and remembering Tiglath-Pileser's lesson, they kept those provinces deliberately sized, so that no single governor could grow powerful enough to rebel. They sent inspectors. They kept records, endless records, because a bureaucracy runs on records, tax rolls, tribute lists, census counts, reports from every corner of the empire, all written down and stored and consulted. Some of the most vivid documents that survive from the whole ancient world are the letters that flowed back and forth between the Assyrian kings and their officials. Governors reporting on harvests and troop movements, spies passing on rumors, scholars advising the king on omens, officials complaining about other officials. It is the ordinary paperwork of running a superpower, and it is startlingly familiar. Binding the whole thing together was a common language, though not, interestingly, the Assyrians' own. The old language of Assyria and Babylon, the one written in wedge-shaped cuneiform on clay, was cumbersome, and as the empire swelled and swallowed peoples, a simpler tongue spread through it as the everyday language of trade and administration, Aramaic, written in an easy alphabet on parchment and other perishable things. It was the practical language of the wider empire, and it spread so successfully on the back of Assyrian and then Babylonian power that it would remain the common speech of the Near East for something like 1,000 years. It was the language ordinary people would still be speaking in that part of the world centuries later, in Roman times. The Assyrians helped make Aramaic the great connective language of the ancient Near East, and in doing so they left a mark on the region far longer lasting than any of their walls. So underneath the war machine there was a second machine, quieter and just as innovative, a machine for governing. Roads and relays and governors and records and a common tongue. Later empires, the Persians, and through them, in spirit, everyone down to Rome, would take this apparatus almost as a given, the basic kit of how you run a large state. But someone had to build it first, and to a remarkable degree, the Assyrians did. Which brings us from the machinery of the empire. Chapter 9. The Kings and Their Palaces. The Assyrian kings were the point of the whole system. Everything, the army, the roads, the records, the deportations, flowed up to a single man who was, in the official understanding, the chosen agent of the god Ashur on earth, the shepherd of the people and the terror of their enemies. And these kings understood, as well as any rulers in history, that power is not only a matter of force, it is a matter of theater. So they built palaces designed to take the breath out of anyone who entered, and to leave no doubt in the mind of any visitor about the scale of the power he was dealing with. One of the first of the truly great imperial kings, a man named Ashur-Nasir-Pal II, moved the center of the empire to a city called Kalhu, the place the Bible calls Kala, and that modern archaeologists know as Nimrud. There he built an enormous palace, and when it was finished, he threw a party to celebrate it that we still know about because he recorded the menu. Nearly 70,000 guests, by his own account, feasted for 10 days, and the king listed the tens of thousands of animals slaughtered and the vast quantities of wine and bread consumed. It was a piece of political theater on a colossal scale, a way of showing the whole world, and every noble and every foreign envoy, the sheer overflowing wealth and reach of the Assyrian crown. You do not throw a 10-day feast for 70,000 people to feed them. You do it to make them understand what you are. The palaces themselves were built to do the same work in stone. Their walls, the long ceremonial corridors that led toward the throne room, were lined with carved stone reliefs, mile upon mile of them, across the various palaces, showing the king at war, the king hunting, the king receiving tribute, the enemies of Assyria falling before him. A visitor did not simply walk to see the king. He walked a long gauntlet of images, each one hammering home the same message. This power is irresistible. This king is favored by the gods, and you are very small. By the time you reached the throne, the architecture had already told you everything you needed to know about your place in the order of things. And at the great doorways stood the guardians, the creatures that are for many people the single most recognizable image of Assyria, the Lamassu. A Lamassu is an enormous figure carved from a single block of stone, with the body of a bull or a lion, the great feathered wings of an eagle, and the bearded head of a man wearing the horned crown of a god. They stood in pairs, flanking the palace gates, some of them taller than 3 men. They were protective spirits set there to guard the threshold and to ward off evil. But they were also, of course, one more piece of the theater. A visitor passing between those vast, calm, watching faces higher than his head could not help but feel the weight of the place pressing down on him. The sculptors even gave them, on some of them, a 5th leg, so that they looked correct both from the front, standing still, and from the side, striding forward. A small, brilliant trick, 3,000 years old, still working on anyone who stands before one in a museum today. These kings and their palaces are where the Assyrian genius for intimidation crossed over into something that has to be called art. The reliefs on those walls are among the greatest achievements of ancient sculpture, extraordinary in their detail and their energy and their command of a scene. The Assyrians poured the same intelligence into these carvings that they poured into their sieges. And that is the paradox we keep circling. The same court that impaled its enemies also produced some of the most sophisticated art of the ancient world, and saw no contradiction in it at all. To them, the art and the terror were the same project, the glorification of the king and the god who stood behind him. We will feel that paradox at its sharpest a little later, in a library. But first, one particular king. Chapter 10: Sargon's Impossible City. Around the year 720 before Christ, the throne of Assyria was taken by one of its most capable and most revealing kings. He called himself Sargon, Sharukin in his own language, a name that means something like "the king is legitimate" or "the true king." And that name is the first clue to the man, because it is almost certainly a name he chose, not one he was born with, and it is a name with an agenda. There had been a Sargon before, a legendary one, nearly 2,000 years earlier, Sargon of Akkad, the first great empire builder of Mesopotamian history, a figure so ancient and so famous that his name was a byword for imperial greatness. For our Assyrian king to take that name was a deliberate claim. It said, "I am a new Sargon, a founder, a maker of empires, a legitimate and world-conquering king." It was the choice of a man who may well have seized the throne in some irregular way. The hint of usurpation hangs around him, and who needed, badly, to look like the rightful heir of the greatest tradition in the world. Sometimes the name a ruler chooses tells you exactly what he is anxious about. And Sargon II was, in fact, a formidable king. He campaigned relentlessly and successfully in every direction, crushed enemies, expanded the borders, and it was he, as we saw, who completed the conquest of Israel and carried off its people. Under him, the empire was as strong as it had ever been. But the thing he is most remembered for, and the thing that says the most about the Assyrian mind, is the city he decided to build from nothing. Not content to rule from the palaces of his predecessors, Sargon commanded that an entirely new capital be raised on empty ground to be his and his alone. He called it Dur-Sharukin, the fortress of Sargon. And it was built at colossal expense, in a great planned rectangle, with a huge palace on a raised platform, temples, and the whole apparatus of an imperial capital, all constructed at once, at the king's word, by the labor of the empire. It was a pure expression of Assyrian power and Assyrian will, the idea that a king could simply speak, and a great city would rise out of bare fields to house his glory. Whole populations of deportees were among those who built it. It was meant to stand forever as the monument to a new Sargon and a new age. And then Sargon died, killed on campaign, his body lost. A terrible omen to the Assyrian mind, a king who fell in battle and whose corpse was never recovered to be buried with honor. and his son, Sennacherib, looked at the enormous, gleaming, barely finished city his father had built and abandoned it. He moved the capital somewhere else entirely, and Dur-Sharukin, the fortress of Sargon, raised at such cost to last for all time, was left half-used and slowly emptied and fell silent. It had been a capital for a handful of years. There is a lesson sitting in the ruins of that city, and it is a very Assyrian one. The same overwhelming power that could raise a capital out of nothing in a few years could also walk away from it in an afternoon, on the whim of a single man, because the entire enormous machine existed to serve the will of one king, and when the king changed, the will changed, and the city that was meant to be eternal was simply abandoned. Power that total is also power that brittle. Hold that thought, because at the very end of tonight's story, it is going to matter enormously. For now, we follow Sennacherib, the son who walked away from his father's city to the place he chose. Chapter 11. Sennacherib and the city in the cage. Sennacherib, the son of Sargon, is in some ways the most vivid of all the Assyrian kings, because his reign collides with a story that hundreds of millions of people would go on to read for thousands of years. He is one of the very few ancient Mesopotamian kings who appears by name as a major figure in the Hebrew Bible. And the two accounts we have of the same event, his own, carved in clay, and the biblical one, written by his enemies, are a perfect lesson in how to read history honestly. Sennacherib abandoned his father's new city and made his capital at Nineveh, an ancient city on the Tigris that he rebuilt on a staggering scale into what may have been, for a time, the largest city in the world. From there, around the year 701 before Christ, he marched west to crush a rebellion among the small kingdoms of the Mediterranean coast, including the kingdom of Judah, ruled by a king named Hezekiah. The campaign went at first exactly as Assyrian campaigns went. Sennacherib rolled through Judah and took its fortified towns one by one. It was here that he besieged and captured the city of Lachish, the siege he was so proud of that he had it carved across a room of his palace, the reliefs we talked about earlier. By his own account and by the archaeology, Lachish was taken and its people deported in the full, methodical, terrible Assyrian way. So far, an ordinary Assyrian success. But then Sennacherib turned toward Jerusalem, Hezekiah's capital, and here something unusual happened. He did not take it. We have his own version, written on clay prisms that survive to this day. Sennacherib boasts of shutting Hezekiah up inside Jerusalem in his memorable phrase, like a bird in a cage. He describes hemming the city in, ravaging the surrounding land, extracting a heavy tribute of gold and silver from Hezekiah. It is a boast of total domination. But read it very carefully and notice what it does not say. It does not say he took Jerusalem. For a king who recorded the fall of every other city in loving detail, that silence is enormous. The Assyrian king who impaled the defiant and carved his victories on his walls does not claim to have captured the one city he most wanted. He claims only to have caged it. Now turn to the other account in the Hebrew Bible. There the story is told as a deliverance. The Assyrian army sits before Jerusalem and its fall seems certain, and then in a single night, catastrophe strikes the besiegers. The biblical text describes it as the work of an angel of the Lord, and Sennacherib breaks off and goes home, and Jerusalem is saved. To the writers of the Bible, this was a miracle, a sign that their God would not let the holy city fall. So which is true? The honest answer is that we cannot fully reconcile them, and we should not pretend to. Something happened before Jerusalem that stopped the most efficient war machine in the world from taking a city it had surrounded. the Assyrian record hides it behind a boast about a bird in a cage. The biblical record turns it into a miracle. Historians have offered sober guesses in between. Perhaps disease broke out in the packed Assyrian camp, as it so often did in ancient sieges. Perhaps trouble elsewhere in the empire called Sennacherib home. Perhaps the tribute Hezekiah paid was simply enough to buy him off. We do not know. What we can say, standing between the two accounts, is that both sides are telling us the same striking fact from opposite directions. Jerusalem, alone among the cities in Sennacherib's path, was not taken. One side calls that a cage, the other calls it a miracle. The truth is somewhere in the gap, and the gap itself is the honest place to stand. Sennacherib went home to Nineveh, and he did one more thing that ties this whole series together. A few years later, enraged by a rebellion in the south, he turned on Babylon, the ancient holy mother city of Mesopotamian civilization, the city we spent a whole night inside not long ago, and he did what even the Assyrians usually shrank from. He sacked it, and by his own boast he tried to erase it, tearing down its temples, flooding its streets, carrying off its gods. It was an act so shocking even to Assyrians that many believed it cursed him. And in time, Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons. The king who caged Jerusalem and drowned Babylon died by the... Chapter 12, Nineveh. Nineveh was the last and greatest of the Assyrian capitals, and for a brief, brilliant span, it was very likely the largest and most magnificent city on the face of the earth. Sennacherib had chosen it, and he rebuilt it to match his idea of himself, which is to say without limit. He threw around it a wall miles in circumference, pierced by great gates, each guarded by the towering Lamassu. He raised within it a palace he called, in a phrase that tells you everything about the Assyrian temperament, the palace without rival. He laid out streets and squares and gardens. And to bring water to that dry city and its gardens, he built engineering works of astonishing ambition, canals and an aqueduct carrying water from the hills many miles away, one stretch of it crossing a valley on a great stone bridge of arches, built of over 2 million blocks of stone. It is one of the oldest aqueducts known anywhere in the world, and it was raised to keep a king's gardens green. Those gardens are worth pausing on because they connect back to a mystery we touched on when we visited Babylon. You will remember the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, traditionally said to have stood in Babylon. And you may remember that we found no solid trace of them there, and no Babylonian record of them at all. There is a serious argument made by respected scholars that the reason we cannot find the Hanging Gardens in Babylon is that they were never in Babylon, that the wondrous terrace gardens, watered by ingenious engineering, that the later Greeks half remembered, were in fact here, in Nineveh Sennacherib's gardens, fed by his great aqueduct, later muddled by storytellers who attached them to the more famous name of Babylon. We cannot prove it, but it is a lovely possibility that one of the 7 wonders of the world has been standing all this time under the wrong city's name, and that it belonged not to gentle Babylon but to fierce Assyria. Whatever the truth of the gardens, Nineveh at its height was a wonder in its own right. Vast, green, walled, adorned, the beating heart of the greatest empire the world had yet seen, drawing tribute and captives and treasure from 1,000 miles in every direction. To stand in it, in the days of its glory, must have felt like standing at the center of the world, in a city that would obviously last forever. I want you to hold that image of Nineveh in its full glory, because it is going to make the end of our story land the way it should. This enormous, magnificent, apparently eternal city, the capital of the terror of nations, is going to vanish so completely that within a few centuries, travelers passing over the very mounds that covered it will have no idea a city was ever there at all. But that is still some way off. Before the fall, we have the strangest and most human chapters of the whole Assyrian story to tell, the ones that complicate the picture of the pure war machine. And they begin. Chapter 13. The Lion Hunt. In the British Museum in London, there is a series of carved stone panels that many people who study ancient art consider among the greatest masterpieces of the entire ancient world. They came from the palace of the last of the great Assyrian kings, Ashurbanipal, at Nineveh, and they show him hunting lions. To understand the Assyrians and the strange doubleness at the heart of them, you have to spend a moment in front of these stones. At first glance, the lion hunt looks like simple royal boasting, the king, powerful and calm, killing dangerous beasts to show his courage. And it is partly that, but it was also something much more formal and more meaningful than sport. The lion, to the Assyrians, was the animal of chaos, of the wild, dangerous forces that pressed in on the ordered world from outside. And the king was the appointed protector of order, the one who stood between his people and the chaos. So the lion hunt was a ritual, a piece of sacred theater, in which the king enacted his deepest role, the master of order defeating the forces of disorder again and again, keeping the world safe. The hunts took place in an enclosure, with the lions released before the king, and the whole event was a ceremony of kingship as much as a display of nerve. But set aside for a moment what the hunt meant, and simply look at how it is carved, because that is where the real surprise waits. The Assyrian sculptors who made these panels did something that almost nobody in the ancient world could do. They carved the lions with an observation and a tenderness and a truthfulness that stops you cold. There is a dying lioness struck by arrows, her back legs already dragging and useless, and yet lifting her head and her chest and roaring. And the sculptor has caught the whole tragedy of the animal, the strength and the pain and the refusal, in a few square feet of stone, 3,000 years ago. People stand in front of that carving in the museum and fall silent, and many of them find that their sympathy has quietly slipped from the king to the lion, which the sculptor surely never intended, and yet which he made possible by seeing the animal so truly. Here we are, once more, at the paradox that is the whole point of the Assyrians. This is the court of the terror of nations, the empire of the impaled and the deported and the caged. And it employed artists who could look at a dying animal and render its suffering with a compassion that reaches across 3,000 years and takes hold of a stranger in a gallery. The same hand that carved the calm processing of human captives at Lachish carved the roar of the dying lioness. The cruelty was real. So was the extraordinary sensitivity of eye. They lived in the same palace, in the same reign, under the same king. Anyone who wants the Assyrians to be simply monsters has to explain the lioness, and cannot. The king who hunted those lions, Ashurbanipal, was in many ways the peak of Assyria, the last of its truly great rulers, presiding over the empire at its widest and richest. And he did one further thing, the thing that redeems some part of all the rest, and that makes him, of all people, one of the great benefactors of the human race. Chapter 14. The Library. Ashurbanipal was, by the standards of ancient kings, a strange and remarkable man because he could read. That sounds like nothing. It was almost unheard of. Kings did not generally read and write. That was the work of scribes, a trained and specialized craft, and a king had scribes the way he had cooks. But Ashurbanipal was proud, genuinely and unusually proud, of his own literacy. He boasted of it the way other kings boasted of conquests, that he had mastered the scribal art, that he could read the difficult old writing, that he understood texts that puzzled the experts. And out of that pride, or that genuine hunger to know, he did something no ruler had ever done before. He set out to collect all of it, all of the knowledge of Mesopotamia, the whole 2,000-year-old inheritance of writing that his civilization sat upon, gathered into one place. He sent his agents out across the empire, into the temples and the old scribal schools, especially in the ancient learned cities of the south, with orders to find tablets and either bring them back or copy them. He wanted everything: the omen texts and the medical texts, the dictionaries and the lists, the prayers, the rituals, the mathematics, the astronomy, and the stories. And he brought it all to Nineveh, to a great collection housed in his palace, organized and catalogued, the first systematically gathered library in the history of the world. Tens of thousands of clay tablets and fragments were assembled there, a genuine attempt to hold the entire written knowledge of a civilization in one building. And because they were written on clay, and because of what was going to happen to Nineveh, they survived, which is a story we will save for another night because it deserves its own. For now, hold on to the astonishing fact that this library existed at all, that the most feared warlord of his age spent his wealth and his agents not only on conquest, but on the patient gathering of knowledge out of what looks very much like real love for it. And here is why it matters to you personally tonight, 3,000 years later. Among the tablets that Ashurbanipal's men gathered and copied and shelved in Nineveh was a poem, an old poem, already ancient in his day, about a king who goes searching for the secret of eternal life after the death of his dearest friend and fails, and comes home and learns to be content with the ordinary mortal life he has. It is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great work of literature in the world. And the reason we have it, the reason you can read the oldest story humanity ever wrote down, the reason those words survived the collapse of everything that made them, is that a cruel Assyrian king who happened to love books had a copy made and stored in his library at Nineveh, and the clay it was written on was baked hard and preserved when his city burned. Think about the shape of that. The Assyrians are remembered above all for destruction. And yet the single most important thing they did for us, the thing that outlasted every wall and every conquest, was an act of preservation, the saving, without meaning to save it for us, of the first voice of human literature. The terror of nations is also the reason the oldest story survives. If you wanted one image to hold the whole contradiction of Assyria in your hand, it would be this: the war machine's last great king, bent over a clay tablet, reading and ordering it kept safe. We are near the top of the mountain now. Under Ashurbanipal, the empire reached its greatest extent and its greatest confidence and its most dangerous moment, the moment when it had, at last, almost nothing left to conquer. What that peak looked like and why it was also the beginning of the fall is where we go next. But first, a look at the invisible. Chapter 15. The Gods and the Omens. It would be easy, after everything we have seen, to imagine the Assyrian kings as cold, practical men of war and administration, calculating everything. But that is not who they were at all, and to understand them you have to step inside the invisible world they actually lived in, which was crowded, at every hour, with gods and signs and dread. The Assyrians were, by our standards, intensely and anxiously religious. Above them stood Ashur, the national god, whose empire this was and in whose name it fought. Beside him stood a whole family of great gods inherited from the deep Mesopotamian past, and one in particular who mattered enormously to the Assyrians at war, Ishtar, the goddess of both love and battle, worshipped especially in the cities of Nineveh and Arbela, a fierce divine patroness who was believed to march before the army and give the king his victories. The Assyrian king was not simply a general. He was the chief servant of these gods, responsible for keeping them satisfied, and the safety of the whole world was understood to depend on his doing that correctly. The gods were believed to be constantly speaking, not in words, but in signs. The Assyrians, like the Babylonians before them, were certain that the divine will was written into the world for those who knew how to read it, and that the future or the intentions of the gods could be glimpsed in 100 kinds of omen. The movements of the planets and the stars, the shape and marks of the liver of a sacrificed sheep studied by trained specialists, the behavior of animals, the pattern of oil poured on water, the birth of a malformed lamb, an eclipse, a dream. All of it was potentially a message, and reading those messages correctly could be, quite literally, a matter of the empire's life or death. So the most powerful king in the world surrounded himself not only with generals but with scholars, a whole learned class of astrologers and diviners and exorcists in constant correspondence with the palace, watching the sky and the omens and writing to the king to tell him what the gods were signaling and what he must do about it. Some of the most fascinating documents to survive from the entire ancient world are these letters, earnest expert scholars reporting to the king on a lunar eclipse and what it means for his reign, advising him on the right ritual to ward off an evil sign, arguing with one another about the interpretation of an omen. When an eclipse threatened the king with death, the Assyrians even had a remarkable ritual to cheat it. They would place a substitute on the throne, a stand-in king to absorb the evil the omen predicted, while the real king stepped aside for a time, and when the danger had passed, the substitute's usefulness was at an end. What this tells us is important, and it humanizes the whole terrifying picture. The Assyrian kings were not swaggering nihilists who feared nothing. They were, underneath the boasting and the terror, men who lay awake worrying about the anger of their gods, who scanned the night sky for warnings, who believed that a wrong ritual or a missed sign could bring the whole divine order crashing down on their heads. The empire that made the world afraid was itself, at its very summit, afraid of the gods, of the signs, of the chaos that the king's whole life was spent holding back. The lion hunt, the terror, the endless war, seen from inside their own minds, all of it was the desperate, sacred labor of holding order against the darkness they genuinely believed was always pressing in. Hold that in mind as we climb to the empire's peak, because there is a grim irony waiting there. The Assyrians spent everything they had holding back the chaos they feared. And the chaos, when it finally came. Chapter 16, The Empire at its Peak. By the middle of the 7th century before Christ, under Ashurbanipal and the strong kings just before him, Assyria reached a height that no state in the history of the world had ever touched. To feel the fall properly, you have to first feel how high the top was. The decisive step came when the Assyrians did something no Mesopotamian power had ever managed. They conquered Egypt. Egypt, the other great ancient civilization of that world, older even than Mesopotamia in its kingship, the land of the pyramids and the pharaohs, impossibly far away down the length of the Levant and across the edge of the desert. Under Ashurbanipal's father Esarhaddon, and then under Ashurbanipal himself, the Assyrian army marched all the way into Egypt, defeated its pharaoh, and took its ancient cities. Ashurbanipal's forces pushed far up the Nile and sacked Thebes, the magnificent religious capital of Egypt, one of the great cities of the ancient world, carrying its wealth back to Nineveh. Stop and take in what that means on a map. At its peak, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the mountains of Persia in the east to the Mediterranean coast, and from the highlands of Anatolia in the north, all the way down through the Levant and into Egypt and up the Nile. Two of the ancient world's great cradles of civilization, Mesopotamia and Egypt, were held for a moment under a single crown in Nineveh. There had never been anything like it. It was, quite simply, the largest empire the world had yet seen, the first to bind together most of the ancient Near East into one dominion. Every major city between the Nile and the Persian hills paid tribute or feared to. The wealth of half the world flowed toward a single palace on the Tigris. And Ashurbanipal presided over it all, the scholar king, the lion hunter, the master of the greatest army and the greatest library on earth, ruling the greatest empire in history from the greatest city in the world. If you had stood in Nineveh in those years, amid the tribute and the temples and the lamassu and the endless carved victories, you would have had every reason to believe you were standing at the permanent center of the world, in an empire so large and so powerful that it could not possibly fall. But look closely at that peak, and you can already see the crack running through it, because the very thing that made Assyria great was also the thing that could not last. The empire had reached its height by conquering endlessly in every direction. Its economy, its politics, its whole identity ran on expansion, on the tribute and the plunder and the captives that flowed in from the next conquest and the next. An empire built to conquer has a terrible problem waiting for it the moment it runs out of things to conquer or grows too large to hold. And Assyria, at its peak under Ashurbanipal, had very nearly reached that moment. It had swelled to the very edge of what it could control. It had made enemies of every people within reach, and it had built a structure that only worked so long as it kept winning. Why an empire like that is so much more fragile than it looks, and how that... Chapter 17: The Weight of Fear. An empire built on terror has a hidden weakness, and it is worth understanding clearly because it explains what is about to happen, and it is a pattern that recurs all through history. Fear is a wonderful tool for conquering and a poor one for holding. When the Assyrian army was strong and present and obviously unbeatable, fear kept the subject peoples quiet. Nobody rebels against a power that has just shown them, in carved and bloody detail, exactly what rebellion costs. But fear only works while the fearsome thing is strong. It creates no loyalty, no love, no genuine consent, nothing that would make a conquered people want the empire to survive. It creates only submission, and submission held down by force, and force has to be everywhere at once, forever, or the whole thing springs back up. The moment the terror weakens even slightly, everything that fear had merely pressed down is still there, coiled, waiting, and now it is also full of hatred. That was the situation the Assyrian Empire had built for itself by the end of its greatness. It sat on top of dozens of conquered nations, none of which loved it, all of which had been brutalized or deported or taxed into resentment, every one of which was simply waiting, consciously or not, for the day the Assyrians looked weak. Babylon, the proud ancient south, humiliated and once even destroyed by its Assyrian overlords, had never stopped wanting its freedom. The peoples of the mountains and the frontiers were always testing the edges. The empire was a vast structure held up almost entirely by the reputation of its army, and reputation, unlike stone, can collapse very quickly. There was a second weakness tangled up with the first. We saw it in Sargon's abandoned city, and it runs all through the Assyrian system. Everything depended on the king. The whole enormous machine, the army, the provinces, the flow of tribute, the holding down of the subject peoples, was organized around the will and the strength of one man at the center. A strong king, like Ashurbanipal, could hold it all in his hand. But a machine that depends entirely on a single strong man has a fatal question built into it. What happens when he dies, or when the man who follows him is weaker, or when two men fight over his throne? An empire held together by fear needs, above all things, a strong and stable center. Because the moment the center wobbles, every one of those resentful subject nations gets its answer to the question it has been asking for 100 years. Is the terror still real? And there was a third thing, quieter and just as dangerous. The endless wars that fed the empire also drained it. Constant campaigning in every direction, year after year for generations, is enormously expensive in men and in treasure and in simple exhaustion. The Assyrian heartland itself was not large. The actual Assyrians were always a minority, ruling a huge foreign population, and every war spent some of that limited core. An empire that must keep conquering to survive is an empire slowly burning its own foundations for fuel. For a long time, the conquests brought in more than they cost. But there is always a point where that reverses, where the machine costs more to run than it captures, and where the whole thing is running on momentum and reputation and the strength of one man. By the time Ashurbanipal died around 630 before Christ, all three of these weaknesses were in place and waiting. A vast, resentful subject population, a system that depended entirely on a strong central king, and a heartland worn thin by centuries of war. The terror had held it all together for 300 years. All it needed was for the terror for one moment. Chapter 18. The Cracks. The death of Ashurbanipal is the hinge of the whole story, the moment the long fall begins. And what is astonishing, looking back, is how little warning there was. Within his own lifetime, Assyria had stood at the absolute summit of the world. Within a generation of his death, it would not exist at all. Almost no great empire in history has fallen so far, so fast. The trouble began, as it so often does, at the top. After Ashurbanipal died, the succession did not pass cleanly. Instead, Assyria fell into exactly the disease it could least afford: internal conflict, quarrels over the throne, kings and rivals fighting one another for the crown while the empire watched. The strong single center that the whole system depended on dissolved into infighting. And every subject people that had been waiting for 100 years to see whether the terror was still real now had its answer. The masters of the world were fighting among themselves. The most dangerous of the watching enemies was the one closest to home and the one with the oldest grievance, Babylon. The ancient southern city, so often dominated and once brutally sacked by its Assyrian overlords, had never accepted its subjection. And now a new and capable leader rose there, a man named Nabopolassar, who seized the throne of Babylon and set about doing what Babylonians had dreamed of for generations, throwing off Assyrian rule entirely. Around the year 626 before Christ, he made himself king in Babylon, and then he began patiently and methodically to push the Assyrians back, evicting their garrisons, taking their cities along the rivers, turning the long tide of history around. But Babylon alone might not have been enough to bring down even a weakened Assyria. What made the fall certain was that Babylon found allies, and the most important of them came from the east, out of the mountains of what is now Iran, the Medes, a rising people under an ambitious king, who had their own scores to settle and their own hunger for the wealth of the Assyrian cities. The Babylonians in the south and the Medes in the east now moved, separately and then together, against the empire that had terrorized them both. Assyria, weakened by its own succession struggles, worn thin by centuries of war, hated by everyone it had ever conquered, suddenly found itself facing a coalition of powerful enemies at the very moment it was least able to fight them. You can feel the momentum shifting in these years, like a great weight beginning to lean. The Assyrians still had their army, still had their reputation, still won battles. But the initiative had passed. They were no longer the ones deciding where the war would be fought. They were reacting, defending, losing a city here and a province there. The frontier that had always moved outward began, for the first time in living memory, to move in. And the enemies, sensing at last that the terror was breakable, pressed harder. The old cities of the Assyrian heartland began to fall. Ashur itself, the ancient holy city, the original home of the god and the nation, the place from which the whole empire took its name, was taken and sacked by the Medes around 614 before Christ. For the Assyrians, the loss of Ashur was more than a military defeat. It was the fall of the sacred center, the heart of the god's own land, and it must have felt like the beginning of the end of the world. And it very nearly was. Because 2 years after Ashur, the enemies came together and marched on the greatest prize of all, on Nineveh, the palace without. Chapter 19. The Fall of Nineveh. In the summer of the year 612 before Christ, the combined armies of the Babylonians and the Medes arrived before the walls of Nineveh, and the empire that had made the world tremble came down to a single siege at its own front gate. There is a terrible symmetry to it that the Assyrians themselves would have understood better than anyone. For 3 centuries, Assyria had been the great taker of cities, the masters of the siege, the people who made every wall in the world meaningless. Now they were on the other side of it. Now it was their wall, the vast and famous wall of Nineveh, with the enemy building up outside it, and the engineers going to work, and the Assyrians inside, discovering at last what it felt like to be the ones behind the wall watching the machine assemble. Everything they had done to 100 cities was now being done to them. Nineveh was enormous and strongly defended, and it did not fall quickly. The siege lasted around 3 months, which tells you the city fought hard. But the outcome, once that coalition had gathered before it, was probably never really in doubt. The defenders were the worn remnant of an overstretched empire. The attackers were the confident, rising powers of the age, with every reason to want Nineveh destroyed. The ancient accounts, and some later tradition, suggest that the river itself played a part in the end, that flooding, or the deliberate breaking of the river's banks, damaged a stretch of the city's defenses and let the attackers in. However exactly it happened, the wall was breached, and the greatest city in the world was open, and the armies of the people Assyria had terrorized for 300 years poured into Nineveh. What followed was the thing the Assyrians had done to others, returned to them in full. The city was sacked and burned. The palace without rival, with its miles of carved reliefs boasting of Assyrian victories, was put to the torch. The great temples were thrown down. The last king in the city died in the fall, by most accounts, amid the destruction of everything his ancestors had built. The wealth of half the world, gathered into Nineveh over centuries, was carried off or destroyed. And the fire that consumed the palaces did one strange, unintended thing that we will bless it for. It baked hard the clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's great library and buried them in the rubble, and so preserved them, waiting for 2,500 years. The burning of Nineveh saved the oldest words in the world. The joy of the empire's enemies was enormous, and we can still hear it, because one of them wrote it down. In the Hebrew Bible, the short book of the prophet Nahum is, from beginning to end, a song of triumph over the fall of Nineveh, a poem of fierce, unrestrained rejoicing that the city of blood, the lion's den, the terror of nations, has finally been brought down. Nineveh is laid waste, it says, and asks who will possibly mourn her, and answers, in effect, that no one will, because everyone she ever touched felt her cruelty. That is what it sounds like when a feared empire falls, not grief, but the open rejoicing of every people it ever made afraid. There were no mourners for Nineveh, there were only the deported and the conquered singing. But the fall of the great city was not quite the very end. A remnant of the Assyrian state fled west and tried for a few more years to survive. That last flicker and the almost unbelievable. Chapter 20. The Vanishing. After Nineveh fell, a fragment of the Assyrian court escaped to the west, to a city called Haran, and there a last king tried to hold together what was left, a government in exile, ruling the shrunken remains of what had days before been the greatest empire on earth. They even found an ally, at the last, in Egypt, the very land they had once conquered, which now, fearing the rising power of Babylon more than the ghost of Assyria, sent an army to help prop the Assyrians up. But it was far too late. Within a few years, Haran too fell to the Babylonians and the Medes. The last king vanished from the record, and the final Assyrian attempt to survive, out near the Euphrates, guttered and went out. By around 609 before Christ, the Assyrian Empire, as a state, simply ceased to exist. Now, empires fall all the time. What is genuinely astonishing about Assyria, the thing that sets it apart from almost every other great power in history, is the completeness of its disappearance. When Rome fell, everyone went on knowing what Rome had been. Its roads and its language and its laws and its ruins were everywhere, and its memory never died for a moment. When Assyria fell, it fell into silence. The heartland was so thoroughly destroyed, the cities so completely burned and abandoned, the Assyrian people so scattered and absorbed, that the empire did not just end. It was, in a sense, erased. The great cities were not rebuilt. Nineveh, the palace without rival, the largest city in the world, was left in its ashes, and over the centuries the wind and the rain brought down what the fire had left, and the dust gathered, and grass grew over the mounds, and the mud bricks slumped back into the earth it had been dug from, until there was nothing on the surface but low hills beside the Tigris. The same happened to Kalhu, and to Ashur, and to the rest. The empire that had carved its glory into stone across 1,000 miles sank quietly under the ground. And here is the detail that captures the whole thing, the one I have been saving. Not very long after the fall, well within the span that Rome would still be flourishing far to the west, a Greek soldier and writer named Xenophon, retreating across that country with an army of stranded mercenaries, marched right past the mounds that covered the ruins of the great Assyrian cities. He saw the huge deserted walls rising out of the ground, and he had no idea what they were. He recorded them as the remains of some old cities and guessed, wrongly, at who might have built them. He did not know he was walking past Nineveh. He did not know that under those grassy mounds lay the capital of the empire that, only 2 centuries before, had ruled the entire Near East and terrified the whole world. In 200 years, the most feared empire in history had passed so completely out of the world that an educated Greek could stand on its grave and not know whose grave it was. For more than 2,000 years after that, Assyria survived only as a name, a half-legend in the pages of the Bible and the Greek writers, a byword for pride and cruelty and sudden downfall, a story about a vanished city of blood that God had cast down. Many people came to doubt whether Nineveh had ever really been a real place at all, rather than a moral fable. The greatest empire the ancient world had produced had become a rumor. That it ever came back to us at all, that we can now speak of Tiglath-Pileser and Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, and stand before the Lamassu and the dying lioness, and read the very tablets from the library at Nineveh, is a story for another night, the story of how, in more recent times, people dug into those silent mounds and were astonished by what came out of the ground. But that is the beginning of the last thing I want to leave you with tonight, the strange truth that the Assyrians, who wanted above all to be remembered as the terror of the world. Chapter 21. What Remains? So what is left in the end of the most feared empire the ancient world ever produced? Not the thing they were most proud of. That is the quiet irony that closes their story, and it is worth sitting with as we come to the end. The terror is gone. That was the whole point of the empire, the thing the kings poured their lives and their art and their cruelty into, to be feared above all other powers, to carve their dominance so deep into the world that it could never be forgotten. And it was forgotten. The fear died with the last Assyrian who felt it. Nobody today is afraid of Assyria. The pillars of skulls and the boasts of the annals, all that enormous machinery of terror, achieved in the very long run precisely nothing. Fear does not last. It cannot. It was the one thing they built their empire on, and it was the first thing to vanish. What lasted was everything else, the things they did almost by accident, or as a side effect, or because a single strange king happened to love books. The idea of the empire itself lasted. The Assyrians worked out, first, how you actually run a vast multi-ethnic state, the standing professional army, the provinces and governors, the roads and the relay of messengers, the bureaucracy of records, the common administrative language. When the Persians rose a couple of generations later and built an even larger and more lasting empire on the same ground, they built it, to a remarkable degree, on Assyrian foundations, inheriting the machinery of empire that Assyria had invented. Through Persia, and through everyone who learned from Persia, the basic pattern the Assyrians worked out, of how a small center governs a huge diverse territory, flows down through the whole later history of empires. They are, in a real sense, the ancestors of the very idea of imperial administration, and that has outlasted them by 26 centuries. The language lasted. Aramaic, the everyday tongue that spread across the Near East on the back of Assyrian and Babylonian power, went on being spoken there for 1,000 years and more. Long after the empire that spread, it was dust. It was, among other things, the language that ordinary people spoke in that part of the world in the time of the Romans. And the words lasted, the ones from the library. This is the part I keep coming back to, because it is so unlikely and so beautiful. Of everything the Assyrians left us, the single most precious thing is a gift they did not even know they were giving, the survival of the oldest literature of humankind. Because a cruel scholar king gathered the writing of his civilization into a library at Nineveh, and because his enemies burned that library down and baked the clay tablets hard and buried them, the Epic of Gilgamesh and a whole lost world of ancient writing survived the end of everything and came back to us across 3,000 years. The Empire of Terror is remembered most of all for an act of preservation. The people who wanted to be the fear of the world are, of all things, the reason we still have the oldest story ever told about being human. A story, as it happens, about a king who wanted to live forever and could not, and had to learn to be content with the ordinary life he had. There may be no better lesson to carry into sleep than that one. The Assyrians spent 3 centuries and untold lives trying to make themselves permanent through fear, and the fear evaporated the moment they were gone. What survived them was the quieter work, the knowledge they gathered, the systems they built, the words they happened to save. In the very long run, it turns out, it is not the terror that lasts, it is the library. And there is something deeply reassuring in that, if you let it settle over you as you drift off. The thought that even the most frightening power the ancient world could produce was, in the end, outlived by a poem. Rest easy. The wall is quiet now. The machine on the plain is 3,000 years gone, and the dying lioness still. That is where we will lead the empire of Assyria tonight. Its terror long since turned to dust, its cities gone softly back into the earth, and its one accidental gift, the oldest story in the world, still here, still being read. Thank you for spending this long night with me and for staying all the way to the end. If this quiet journey helped you slow down and drift towards sleep, you can help the channel more than you know by subscribing and by leaving a like. It is a small thing, and it is what lets these calm nights keep coming. Sleep well. Rest easy. And I will see you next week for another quiet history. Until then, let the river and the buried cities and the roar of the stone lioness carry you gently off to sleep.